The bitter December wind cut through Margaret Sullivan's worn wool coat as she stood at the gates of Sullivan Ranch, the land her father had carved from raw Texas prairie with his own 2 hands. Behind her, a single pack horse carried everything she was allowed to take a change of clothes, her mother's Bible, and hidden deep in her saddlebag, a folded document that might be her only hope. "You heard what the judge said," Thomas Hartley called from the porch, his voice carrying that false sympathy she'd grown to despise. Her former husband stood there in her father's sheepskin jacket, one arm draped possessively around her stepmother's shoulders. "The ranch belongs to your mother now, and she's chosen to let me manage it. Best you move along before the sheriff has to escort you off." Margaret's jaw clenched, but she kept her voice steady. "Eleanor isn't my mother. She's the woman who waited exactly 3 months after Papa's funeral to bring you back here." Eleanor Hartley, formerly Eleanor Sullivan, stepped forward, her mourning dress as false as her tears had been at the funeral. "Now, Margaret dear, there's no need for such bitterness. Your father would want us all to move forward peacefully. My father would have shot Thomas on sight if he'd known what kind of man he really was," Margaret said quietly. "But then, Papa always did have a blind spot when it came to pretty faces and sweet words." Thomas's face darkened, and he took a step down from the porch. "Watch your tongue, woman. You're not the princess of this ranch anymore." Margaret turned to face him fully, and something in her green eyes made him pause. She might be leaving with nothing but the clothes on her back, but Sullivan blood still ran in her veins, the same blood that had fought Comanches, survived droughts, and built an empire from dust. "I was never a princess," she said. "I was my father's daughter. I rode fence in blizzards, birthed calves in mud, and learned to shoot straight enough to drop a rattler at 20 paces. This land knows my footsteps better than it'll ever know yours." "Pretty speeches won't change the law," Eleanor interjected smoothly. "The will was quite clear. Everything goes to the surviving spouse." Margaret's hand instinctively moved toward her saddlebag before she caught herself. The other will, the real one. The one she'd found hidden in her father's desk just yesterday, burned like a brand against her consciousness. But showing it now, with the sheriff in Thomas's pocket and no lawyer willing to stand against the powerful Hartley family, would only see it destroyed. "The law," Margaret repeated softly. "Yes, I suppose even Texas has to pretend it's civilization sometimes." She turned to her horse, an aging bay gelding named Dusty that Thomas had graciously allowed her to keep, mostly because the animal was too old to be worth selling. As she checked the saddle's girth one last time, she heard footsteps behind her. "Margaret." The voice belonged to Sam Chen, the ranch's Chinese cook who'd been with them for 15 years. He pressed a small cloth bundle into her hands. "Food for the road," he said quietly in accented English. Then, even quieter, "Your father was good man. This is not right." "Thank you, Sam," she managed past the sudden tightness in her throat. "Where will you go?" he asked. Margaret looked west, toward the endless horizon where the land rolled on forever beneath the vast Texas sky. "Away," she said simply, "far enough that I can think clearly again." Other ranch hands had gathered near the barn, men who'd worked alongside her for years. Jake Morrison, the foreman who'd taught her to rope when she was 12, the Martinez brothers, who'd helped her save the Remuda during the flood of '69, old Pete, who'd carved her wooden toys when she was small. They stood silent, their faces carefully neutral, but she could read the anger in their stiff shoulders, the shame in their downcast eyes. Thomas noticed the gathering and strode down from the porch. "Any man who's thinking of leaving with her can pack his gear now," he announced. "I won't have divided loyalties on my ranch." My ranch. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. 27 years she'd lived here, and in the span of 6 months since her father's death, it had become Thomas Hartley's ranch. "Don't," she said quietly to Jake, who'd taken a half-step forward. "You all have families to feed. Papa would understand." She mounted Dusty with the same easy grace she'd had since childhood, settling into the saddle like coming home. From this height, She could see over the ranch gates to the land beyond the creek where she'd learned to swim, the hill where her mother was buried, the far pastures where the cattle grazed on winter grass. "You know," she said conversationally, loud enough for Thomas and Eleanor to hear. "Papa used to tell me that the land doesn't really belong to anyone. We're just caretakers, holding it in trust for those who come after. He said the land remembers everything, every kindness, every cruelty, every drop of honest sweat, and every stolen gain." Thomas shifted uncomfortably. "Superstitious nonsense." "Maybe," Margaret agreed. "But Papa also used to say that ill-gotten gains never prosper, that what's taken by treachery will be lost the same way." "Is that a threat?" Thomas stepped closer to her horse. Margaret looked down at him, and for just a moment, she let him see everything. The rage, the grief, the iron determination that Sullivan women had carried since her grandmother had crossed the Mississippi in a covered wagon. "No," she said softly. "It's a promise. Not from me to you, but from this land to anyone who thinks they can hold it with false papers and bought judges. The land remembers, Thomas, and the land is patient." She turned Dusty toward the gate, touching her heels lightly to his flanks. The old horse moved forward with surprising energy, as if he too was eager to leave this place of betrayal behind. "Don't come back," Thomas shouted after her. "You show your face here again, and I'll have you arrested for trespassing." Margaret didn't turn around. She kept her back straight, her head high, letting them see a Sullivan riding away unbroken. Only when she'd passed through the gates and the ranch buildings had disappeared behind the first rise did she allow her shoulders to slump. The tears came then, hot and bitter in the cold wind. Tears for her father, whose trust had been so cruelly betrayed. Tears for the home she'd lost. Tears for the future that had been stolen from her, the ranch she'd been raised to run. The legacy that should have been hers. But as she rode west into the gathering dusk, the tears dried on her cheeks, leaving only salt and determination behind. In her saddlebag, the true will waited like a coiled rattler. She needed allies, needed proof that would stand up in a court not bought by Hartley gold. She needed time to plan, to think, to find a way to honor her father's real wishes. The wind picked up, bringing the scent of sage and distant rain. Somewhere out there in the vast Texas wilderness, she would find what she needed. And then she would return, not with tears or pleas, but with justice. Behind her, the lights of Sullivan Ranch grew dim in the distance. Ahead, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Margaret Sullivan rode on into the night, carrying nothing but her father's will and her mother's Bible, her past stolen but her future still unwritten. The land remembered, and so would she. The snow began falling just after midnight, thick flakes that turned the world white and treacherous. Margaret had pushed too hard, trying to put as much distance as possible between herself and Sullivan Ranch. Now, with Dusty stumbling in the deepening drifts and the temperature dropping fast, she realized her mistake. She'd been heading vaguely toward Pecos, knowing there were settlements there, people who might remember her father fondly enough to offer temporary shelter. But in the swirling snow, she'd lost the trail. The familiar landmarks were obscured, and even the stars were hidden behind heavy clouds. Dusty snorted, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Ice had formed on his whiskers, and Margaret could feel him trembling beneath her. She dismounted, leading him instead, trying to share his burden. Her feet were numb in her boots, and the wind cut through her coat like it was paper. "Just a little farther, boy," she murmured, though she had no idea farther meant salvation or doom. Then, through the white curtain of snow, she saw it a faint glow of lamplight, a homestead, modest but sturdy, with smoke rising from the chimney to be torn away by the wind. Margaret's heart leaped, but she approached cautiously. These were dangerous times, and a woman alone had to be careful about whose door she knocked on. As she drew closer, she could make out more details: a well-maintained barn, fences in good repair, A small garden plot covered for winter. Everything spoke of careful attention, of someone who took pride in what they'd built. It reminded her painfully of how Sullivan Ranch had looked under her father's care. She was still deciding whether to approach when the front door opened, spilling warm light onto the snow. A man stepped out, rifle in hand but not raised, peering into the storm. Margaret's heart stopped. Even through the snow, even after 8 years, she knew him instantly. Matthew Coleman, though he'd been just Matt back then, the quiet young man who'd worked her father's ranch for 2 seasons before leaving to make his own way. "Who's there?" he called, his voice carrying that same steady calm she remembered. "It's—" Her voice cracked, whether from cold or emotion she couldn't say. "It's Margaret Sullivan. Mr. Coleman, I'm sorry to trouble you, but—" The rifle lowered immediately. "Margaret," he stepped off the porch, heedless of the snow. "Good Lord, what are you doing out in this weather?" "I got turned around in the storm," she said, which was true enough. "My horse needs rest, and I—" "Come inside," he said, already reaching for Dusty's reins. "Both of you, before you freeze solid. We'll get your horse settled first." She followed him to the barn, noting how he moved with the same quiet efficiency she remembered. He'd filled out some in the intervening years, his shoulders broader, his face weathered by sun and wind, but his hands were still gentle as he helped her unsaddle Dusty, rubbing the old horse down with straw and settling him in a stall with fresh hay and water. "He'll be fine," Matt said, running an experienced hand along Dusty's legs to check for injury. "Tough old boy, aren't you?" He glanced at Margaret. "The house is warmer. Can you make it?" She nodded, though in truth she wasn't sure. Her legs felt like wooden posts, and the barn was beginning to spin slightly. Matt must have seen something in her face because he moved closer, offering his arm. "Just lean on me," he said quietly. "It's not far." The walk to the house seemed to take forever, though it couldn't have been more than 50 yards. By the time they reached the door, Margaret was shaking so hard she could barely stand. Matt half-carried her inside, settling her in a chair by the fire. "Stay there," he ordered, already moving with purpose. He returned with blankets, wrapping them around her before setting a kettle on the stove. "When's the last time you ate?" Margaret tried to remember. She'd been too upset to eat yesterday after finding the will. And this morning, had it only been this morning, she'd been too focused on confronting Thomas and Eleanor. "Yesterday, I think," she admitted. Matt's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, busying himself at the stove. Soon the smell of coffee filled the small room, along with the sizzle of bacon and eggs. Margaret's stomach cramped with hunger, but she was more aware of her surroundings now that the immediate danger had passed. The house was small but well built, everything clean and orderly. There were books on a shelf by the window, a guitar propped in one corner, a few pieces of good furniture that looked handmade. It was a bachelor's home, but one that spoke of permanence, of roots being put down. "Here," Matt set a plate in front of her, along with a mug of coffee so hot it steamed. "Eat slow. Your stomach won't thank you if you wolf it down." She wanted to protest that she wasn't some charity case, but the first bite of food destroyed any pretense of pride. She was starving, frozen, and grateful. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackling fire and the wind howling outside. Finally, warm and fed, Margaret found her voice. "Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if—" "You'd have died," Matt said bluntly. "Temperature's dropping fast, and that storm's fixing to last all night. What were you thinking? Riding out alone in weather like this?" The gentle rebuke in his voice brought unexpected tears to her eyes. When was the last time anyone had worried about her safety? Not since her father. "I didn't have a choice," she said quietly. Matt studied her face in the firelight. "I heard about your father," he said after a moment. "I'm sorry. He was a good man." "Yes, he was." Margaret stared into her coffee mug. "Too good. Maybe too trusting." And Thomas Hartley. The name came out flat, carefully neutral. Margaret's hands tightened on the mug. My former husband. He and my stepmother now own Sullivan Ranch. The judge was very clear about that. I see. Matt stood, refilling both their cups. When he sat back down, he was watching her with those steady gray eyes she remembered. You know, when I worked for your father, I always wondered. What? Why you married Hartley. Even then, I could see he wasn't. He stopped, shaking his head. Sorry, it's none of my business. No, you're right. Margaret felt a bitter smile twist her lips. He wasn't worthy of many things, but I was 20, and he was handsome and charming, and Papa wanted to see me settled. Thomas knew exactly what to say, how to act. It wasn't until after the wedding that I saw what lay beneath. She'd never spoken of it to anyone, but here in this warm room, with the storm raging outside and Matt's quiet presence across from her, the words came easier. He was cruel in small ways at first. Words that cut, rules that constrained. By the time I understood what I'd married, it was too late. And then Papa got sick. You stayed for your father. It wasn't a question. Margaret nodded. Thomas needed Papa's approval to maintain his position. As long as Papa lived, I had some protection. But after, there was nothing stopping him from taking everything. Eleanor helped. They'd been planning it together. I think the will that gave her everything. It appeared so conveniently. And the judge, well, Thomas has many friends. Matt was quiet for a long moment. Then, where were you heading in the storm? Pecos, maybe. Somewhere I could find work. Start over. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. I'm 27 years old, and I don't even own the clothes on my back. Everything I'm wearing belongs to Sullivan Ranch, according to the law. The law, Matt repeated, and there was something in his voice that made her look up. Sometimes the law and what's right don't walk the same path. No, she agreed softly. They don't. He stood abruptly, moving to the window to peer out at the storm. You'll stay here tonight, tomorrow too, if the storm hasn't passed. After that, he turned back to her. After that, we'll see. I can't impose. It's not an imposition. His voice was firm. Your father gave me a chance when no one else would. Hired a green kid who didn't know a stirrup from a surcingle. Taught me everything I know about ranching. I owed him more than I could ever repay. You don't owe me anything, Margaret said. Don't I? He moved back to his chair, but didn't sit. You know why I left Sullivan Ranch? She shook her head. Because I was young and foolish enough to think I had a chance. Because watching you marry Thomas Hartley was like watching someone put a songbird in a cage. He met her eyes steadily. Because staying would have meant doing something that would have gotten me hanged and you dishonored. Margaret's breath caught. She'd wondered, back then, there had been moments a look held too long, a hand extended to help her mount that lingered just slightly, conversations by the corral that felt like more than they were. But she'd been promised to Thomas, and Matt had been her father's employee, and it had seemed impossible. Matt, I'm not that young fool anymore, he said quietly. I've got my own land now, small but mine, built this house with my own hands. I've made a life here. But I never forgot. He trailed off, then seemed to gather himself. You need rest. Take the bedroom, I'll bed down out here by the fire. I couldn't. You could and you will. His tone brooked no argument. Whatever else happens, tonight you're safe. Tomorrow's troubles can wait for tomorrow. Margaret stood slowly, the blanket still wrapped around her. She wanted to say something, to acknowledge what hung in the air between them, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she simply said, "Thank you." Matt nodded, already turning away to bank the fire. Sleep well, Margaret. You're home now. The words followed her into the small, clean bedroom. Home. Such a simple word. but after losing everything, it sounded like a promise. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside Matt Coleman's house, Margaret Sullivan finally felt warm again. The fever came in the depths of the night. Margaret woke disoriented, her nightgown soaked with sweat despite the cold room. Her throat felt like she'd swallowed broken glass, and when she tried to sit up, the world tilted alarmingly. "Matt?" The word came out as barely a whisper. She tried again, louder, but her voice cracked. The effort sent her into a coughing fit that left her gasping. She needed water, but when she attempted to stand, her legs buckled beneath her. The door burst open, and Matt appeared in the doorway, lamp in hand. He took one look at her crumpled form on the floor and set the lamp aside, dropping to his knees beside her. "You're burning up," he said, pressing the back of his hand to her forehead. Without another word, he lifted her blankets and all and carried her back to the bed. "I'm sorry," she managed between chattering teeth. "I'm not usually so—" "Hush." His voice was gentle but firm. "You've been through too much. Your body's just catching up with what your spirit's been enduring." He disappeared and returned with a basin of cool water and clean cloths. With careful hands, he wrung out a cloth and placed it on her forehead. The relief was immediate, though temporary. "I need to bring your fever down," he said. "This might be uncomfortable, but it's necessary." Margaret nodded, too miserable to care about propriety. Matt worked with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything else, cooling her face and neck with damp cloths, coaxing her to drink water mixed with willow bark tea. The night passed in a haze of fever dreams. Sometimes she was back at Sullivan Ranch, arguing with Thomas while her father watched sadly from his portrait. Sometimes she was a child again, riding across endless prairies with her mother's laughter echoing on the wind. And sometimes she was here, in this small, warm room, with Matt's steady presence anchoring her to reality. When she woke properly, pale winter sunlight was filtering through the window. The fever had broken, leaving her weak but clear-headed. Matt was dozing in a chair beside the bed, looking haggard. He'd stayed with her all night. "You should have woken me," she said softly. His eyes opened immediately, focusing on her face. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by a herd of longhorns, but alive." She struggled to sit up, and he helped her, propping pillows behind her back. "Thank you. Again." "You scared me," he admitted, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "For a while there, I thought—" He shook his head. "Are you hungry?" Her stomach answered before she could, growling loudly. They both laughed, and something eased between them. "I'll take that as a yes," Matt said, standing. "Don't try to get up yet. I'll bring you something." He returned with a tray bearing broth, fresh bread, and more of the bitter willow bark tea. As she ate slowly, he sat back in the chair, watching her with those thoughtful gray eyes. "Tell me," he said quietly. "Tell me what really happened." So she did. Everything from her father's sudden death, too sudden. She'd always thought, to Thomas's gradual takeover of ranch operations, the appearance of Eleanor, claiming to have secretly married her father months before his death, the will that materialized so conveniently, witnessed by men who owed Thomas money. And then yesterday, I was going through Papa's desk one last time before they made me leave. There was a secret compartment I'd forgotten about. Papa showed it to me when I was young. Inside was another will, the real one. Matt leaned forward. "You have it." "In my saddlebag. It's dated 2 weeks before his death, properly witnessed by Judge Morrison from Austin and Father Miguel from the mission. It leaves the ranch to me, with a comfortable provision for Eleanor, but no control. Nothing for Thomas at all. Judge Morrison's a straight arrow. He'd never sign a false document. Which is why I think this one is real. But Thomas has the local judge in his pocket, and most of the town council, too. If I'd shown it there, it would have disappeared, and maybe you with it." Matt's jaw tightened. You did right to run. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Margaret said, I heard you built this place yourself. Matt's face softened slightly. Took 3 years. Started with just a dugout shelter and big dreams. Your father helped, actually, sold me some starter cattle at a fair price, extended credit when I needed it. That sounds like Papa. Margaret smiled sadly. He always said the measure of a man wasn't what he had, but what he built with his own hands. Wise man. I've got 40 head now, good grazing rights, and contracts with the Army Fort for beef. It's not Sullivan Ranch, but it's mine. It's wonderful, Margaret said, and meant it. You should be proud. I am. He paused, then added quietly, though it's felt a bit empty. A house isn't really a home without... He trailed off, but Margaret heard what he didn't say. She set down her spoon, gathering her courage. That night, the last night before you left Sullivan Ranch, do you remember... Every detail. His voice was rough. You wore a blue dress to dinner. We talked by the corral after, about books and dreams and whether the stars were different in other places. I almost... Almost what? Almost begged you not to marry him. Almost told you that I'd work every day of my life to give you a good home, that I'd treasure you like you deserved. He looked away. But what did I have to offer? Nothing but calloused hands and promises. Matt. She waited until he looked at her. Do you know what Thomas offered? Money? Yes. Position? Certainly. But in 7 years of marriage, he never once looked at me the way you're looking at me now. His breath caught. Margaret. I'm not saying... I mean, I can't... She felt heat in her cheeks that had nothing to do with fever. I'm still married in the eyes of the law, and I'm a woman with nothing, hiding from powerful enemies. I have no right to speak of feelings or futures. Don't. Matt moved to sit on the edge of the bed, taking her hand in his. Don't talk about rights and what's proper. Not here, not with me. His hands were calloused indeed, but gentle. Margaret turned her palm up, tracing the lines of hard work etched there. I used to watch you, she admitted quietly, from the house windows. When you were breaking horses, you had such patience, such understanding. They trusted you completely by the end. Horses are simple, Matt said. They respond to kindness and consistency. People are more complicated. Are they? Margaret met his eyes. I think perhaps we make things more complicated than they need to be. He squeezed her hand gently, then released it and stood. You need rest, real rest, not fever dreams. When you're stronger, we'll figure out what to do about that will. You don't think I'm letting you face Thomas Hartley alone, do you? Your father gave me a chance when no one else would. Now it's my turn to return the favor. This isn't your fight. Isn't it? He turned at the doorway. I told you I left Sullivan Ranch because I couldn't watch you marry him. That wasn't the whole truth. What was... I left because if I'd stayed, I'd have called him out, challenged him properly, faced him with pistols at dawn like gentlemen do. Except I wouldn't have been doing it like a gentleman. I'd have been doing it like a man in love who couldn't bear to see the woman he loved thrown away on someone who'd never value her. The words hung in the air between them. 8 years of silence finally broken. And now? Margaret asked softly. Now, Matt smiled, and it transformed his weathered face. Now I'm older, maybe a little wiser. I know killing Thomas wouldn't solve anything. But I also know that sometimes the universe gives you a second chance. When it does, only a fool wastes it. He left her then, closing the door softly behind him. Margaret lay back against the pillows, her mind whirling. The fever had broken more than just her physical illness. It had broken through the walls she'd built around her heart. Outside, she could hear Matt moving about, the normal sounds of a ranch in winter, feeding stock, breaking ice on water troughs, the 100 small tasks that kept a place running, familiar sounds that reminded her of better times, of a life where hard work meant something and a person's word was their bond. She thought about the will hidden in her saddlebag. Thomas would never give up Sullivan Ranch willingly, and challenging him would be dangerous. But lying here in Matt Coleman's simple, honest home, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. The storm had passed, leaving the world crystalline and new under fresh snow. Perhaps it was a sign. Perhaps some storms were necessary to wash away the old and make room for something better. Margaret closed her eyes. Not to sleep, but to plan. She had the true will. She had an ally who'd proven himself trustworthy, and she had the truth. It would have to be enough. The morning sun was barely over the horizon when Margaret stepped out of the house, breathing in the crisp winter air. 3 days had passed since the fever broke, and she was determined to earn her keep. Matt had protested, of course, insisting she needed more rest. But Margaret Sullivan had never been one to sit idle when there was work to be done. "You sure you're up to this?" Matt asked, watching her pull on a pair of his old work gloves. They swallowed her hands completely. "I need to be useful," she said simply. "I can't just exist here like some kind of ghost." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough. Come on, then. We'll start with the chickens." Margaret had gathered eggs before, but always as the ranch owner's daughter, a quick chore before returning to the house. Now, Matt showed her how to really tend the birds, checking for signs of illness, cleaning the coop properly, understanding their patterns and needs. "That red hen there, she likes to hide her eggs," he explained, pointing to a russet bird pecking near the fence. "You'll find them behind the water bucket usually, and the black ones broody don't reach under her unless you want pecked fingers." It was strange, learning these small intimacies of his daily life. Each animal had a personality, a history. The milk cow was called Buttercup, bought from a family moving further west. The barn cat, a massive orange tom, was inexplicably named Lady Jane. The former owner's daughter named him. Matt explained with a grin. By the time we realized the mistake, it had stuck. After the chickens came the real work. Matt led her to the barn where 2 cows waited for milking. Margaret had seen it done countless times, but had never actually performed the task herself. "It's all in the rhythm," Matt said, demonstrating. "Firm but gentle. They'll let you know if you're doing it wrong." Her first attempts were disasters. The cows shifted restlessly. Milk sprayed everywhere but in the bucket, and her hands cramped from the unfamiliar motion. But Matt was patient, correcting her grip, showing her how to lean her head against the cow's warm flank for stability. "You're thinking too hard," he said after her 4th failed attempt. "It's not a battle of wills, it's a conversation." Something in his words clicked. Margaret took a breath, relaxed her shoulders, and tried again. This time, the milk rang steadily into the bucket. "There you go," Matt said softly, and the pride in his voice warmed her more than any fire could have. The days fell into a pattern. Morning chores, breakfast together at the small kitchen table, then out to tend the cattle. Matt was breaking horses for the army contract, and Margaret would sit on the fence rail watching him work, marveling at his patience. "You never force them," she observed one afternoon, watching him work with a particularly spirited bay mare. "Force just creates fear," Matt replied, never taking his eyes off the horse. "Fear might get you obedience, but it'll never get you trust, and trust is what matters in the long run." She wondered if they were still talking about horses. In the evenings, they'd sit by the fire. Matt would work on repairing tack or carving something from wood while Margaret mended clothes, his and hers, since she only had what she'd ridden out with. It was during one of these quiet evenings that she finally asked about the books on his shelf. "You read more than you used to," she said, noting titles by Dickens and Twain alongside practical volumes on animal husbandry and range management. Matt flushed slightly. "Your father, actually, he lent me books. Said a man should feed his mind as well as his body. After I left, I kept the habit." "May I?" She gestured toward the shelf. "Of course. What's mine is—" He caught himself. color deepening. "That is, you're welcome to anything you need." She selected a volume of poetry, something that surprised her. Whitman, a gift from the school teacher in town. She said I needed more beauty in my life. He paused. She wasn't wrong, though I don't think poetry was what was missing. The words hung between them, weighted with meaning. Margaret opened the book, reading aloud to fill the sudden tension. "I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you." Her voice faltered on the last line. When she looked up, Matt was watching her with an expression that made her heart race. "Margaret," he began, then stopped. "I need to teach you to shoot." The abrupt change startled her. "What?" "A woman alone needs to be able to defend herself. You said you could shoot." "I can. Papa taught me when I was 12. "Show me." The challenge in his voice sparked her pride. She set down the book and followed him outside, where he'd set up targets at varying distances. He handed her his rifle, a well-maintained Winchester. "Whenever you're ready." Margaret hefted the rifle, finding her stance. It had been years, but her body remembered. She sighted down the barrel, breathed out slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The shot went wide, missing the target entirely. "Rifle shoots different than a pistol," Matt said mildly. "Try again." Her second shot was better, clipping the edge of the target. By the fifth, she was hitting center consistently. When she lowered the rifle, Matt was smiling. "Your father taught you well, but can you do it when your hands are shaking, when you're scared?" "I don't know," she admitted. "Let's hope you never have to find out, but just in case." He spent the rest of the afternoon drilling her. Different positions, different scenarios. By the time they finished, the sun was low and her arms ached. "Why now?" she asked as they walked back to the house. "Why today?" Matt was quiet for a long moment. "Had a visitor while you were resting yesterday. Jeremiah Clark has a ranch about 10 miles north. He'd heard Thomas Hartley was looking for his runaway wife, offering a reward for information about where she might be hiding." Margaret's blood chilled. "He knows I'm here." "No, Jeremiah's a good man. Came to warn me. But if Thomas is looking that hard..." He turned to face her. "We need to move on. That will sooner rather than later. The longer we wait, the more time he has to solidify his position." "We," Margaret noted. "Matt, this isn't..." "Don't." His voice was firm. "Don't tell me again this isn't my fight. You've been here 2 weeks. Margaret, you've worked beside me, shared my table, mended my clothes. You've made this place feel more like a home than it's ever been. So yes, we..." She wanted to protest, to protect him from the danger she'd brought to his door. But the words died unspoken, because the truth was, she didn't want to face this alone. And more than that, she didn't want to leave. "What do you suggest?" she asked instead. "Judge Morrison in Austin. If he witnessed the real will, he'll remember it. We take it to him, get his support, then file proper papers. Make it official before Thomas can interfere. Austin's a week's ride in good weather. 5 days if we push, 4 if we change horses at way stations." He paused. "It's dangerous. Thomas might have men watching the roads." "Everything's dangerous now," Margaret said quietly. "At least this offers hope." They stood in the gathering dusk, the house warm and lamplit behind them. Matt reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture was tender, intimate, speaking volumes without words. "There's something else," he said. "Something I should have said that first night. I'm not asking for anything. Margaret, no expectations, no claims. But you should know." "I know," she interrupted softly. "I've known since you carried me in from the storm. Maybe I knew 8 years ago and was too young and foolish to trust it. And now?" She looked up at him, this good man who'd opened his home and risked his safety for her, who treated her as an equal, who was patient with her mistakes, who looked at her like she was something precious rather than a possession. Now I'm neither young nor foolish, and I know the difference between a cage and a home. Matt's breath caught. He leaned closer, and for a moment Margaret thought he might kiss her. But voices carried on the wind riders approaching, and they stepped apart quickly. 3 men rode up to the house, and Margaret recognized Jeremiah Clark from Matt's description. The other 2 were strangers, but their bearing suggested they were ranchers too. "Matt," Jeremiah called. "We need to talk. It's about Hartley." They gathered in the house, Margaret serving coffee while the men spoke in low, urgent tones. Thomas had been making moves, using his newfound wealth to buy up water rights, forcing smaller ranchers to sell or face ruin. "He's building an empire," one of the men said grimly. "And he doesn't care who he destroys doing it." "Then maybe it's time someone stopped him," Matt said quietly. The men looked at each other, then at Margaret. Jeremiah cleared his throat. "Ma'am," meaning no disrespect, "but we heard tell you might have something that could help with that." Margaret met Matt's eyes. He nodded slightly. She made her decision. "I have my father's real will," she said. "Thomas Hartley has no legal claim to Sullivan Ranch." The room erupted in voices, questions, plans, and in the middle of it all, Margaret felt something shift. She was no longer alone, no longer helpless. She had allies, she had proof, and she had purpose. The fight to reclaim her inheritance was just beginning. The storm rolled in just after midnight, thunder shaking the small house like the hoofbeats of wild horses across the sky. Margaret woke to the sound of Matt's voice outside, shouting over the wind. Through the window, she could see him struggling with a section of fence that had broken loose, the cattle milling nervously beyond. She didn't think twice. Pulling on his spare coat and boots, she ran out into the deluge. Rain hit her like cold fists, instantly soaking through everything, but she pressed forward. "The gate," Matt yelled, pointing. "If it goes, we'll lose the whole herd." Margaret understood immediately. The cattle, spooked by the storm, were pressing against the gate that led to open range. If it gave way, they'd scatter for miles. She fought her way through the mud, reaching the gate just as a massive steer slammed against it. The impact nearly knocked her down, but she held on, throwing her weight against the wooden rails. Matt appeared beside her, his face barely visible in the darkness. Together, they braced the gate while he worked to secure it with rope. The rain was brutal, turning the ground to thick mud that sucked at their boots. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the chaos, cattle bellowing, wind howling. The world turned primal and dangerous. "There!" Matt shouted. "The barn door!" It had blown open, banging violently. Inside, the horses were panicking. Margaret started toward it, but her feet slipped in the mud. She went down hard, the breath knocked from her lungs. For a moment, she couldn't move, couldn't breathe, could only lie there while the storm raged. Then Matt's hands were under her arms, lifting her. "I've got you," he said against her ear. "Can you stand?" She nodded, finding her feet. They made it to the barn together, fighting to secure the door. The horses were wild-eyed but unharmed, and Matt moved among them with calm words and steady hands until they settled. Finally, soaked and exhausted, they stumbled back to the house. Margaret's teeth were chattering so hard she couldn't speak. Matt built up the fire while she stood dripping on the floor, too cold to even shiver properly. "You need to get out of those wet things," he said, but Margaret's frozen fingers couldn't manage the buttons. "I can't." Without a word, Matt stepped closer. His own hands were cold but steady as he unbuttoned the coat, peeling the sodden fabric from her shoulders. There was nothing improper in his touch, only concern. But Margaret felt heat bloom beneath her chilled skin. "Go change," he said softly. "I'll make something hot." She managed to get into dry clothes, her spare dress and one of Matt's shirts over it for warmth. When she returned to the main room, He'd changed too, and there was coffee brewing, the rich smell filling the space. They sat close to the fire, shoulders touching, sharing the warmth. The storm continued its assault outside, but inside felt safe, a small circle of light against the darkness. "Thank you," Matt said quietly. "I couldn't have held that gate alone." "We're partners, aren't we?" Margaret replied, surprised by how natural the word felt. He turned to look at her then, and something in his expression made her breath catch. They were sitting so close she could see the flecks of gold in his gray eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Margaret," he murmured, lifting a hand to her face. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, gentle as a whisper. "Stop!" she breathed, but her hand came up to cover his, holding it in place. "Stop! I'm yours." The words hung between them, more binding than any vow. Matt's eyes darkened, and he leaned closer. "Forever, darling," he whispered against her lips. "Forever." The kiss was everything their relationship had been: patient, deep, built on a foundation of trust and shared struggle. Margaret had been kissed before, but never like this. Never as though she was precious. Never as though the person kissing her would wait a lifetime just for this moment. When they finally drew apart, both were breathing unsteadily. Matt rested his forehead against hers, his hands framing her face. "I've wanted to do that for 8 years, he admitted. "Only 8, Margaret managed, her voice shaky. "I think I've been waiting my whole life." He kissed her again, shorter but no less sweet. Then, with visible effort, he pulled back. "You're still married," he said, the words heavy with regret. "In the eyes of the law." "The law that gave Thomas everything." Margaret's voice turned fierce. "The law that says I'm his property, I reject it. My marriage ended the day he showed his true nature, law or no law." And in the eyes of God, it was a fair question. Margaret considered carefully. "God knows what's in my heart. He knows what Thomas is, what our marriage was, and I believe I have to believe that he wouldn't want me bound forever to a man who broke every sacred vow from the moment he made them." Matt nodded slowly. "When this is over, when you have your ranch back and your freedom legal and proper—" "Yes," Margaret said simply. "Yes to whatever you're about to ask. Yes to everything." He laughed, the sound mixing with the thunder outside. "I haven't asked yet." "Then ask." But he shook his head, smiling. "Not yet. Not until I can do it properly, with a ring and a future to offer that doesn't include running from your past." Margaret wanted to protest that she didn't need rings or propriety, but she understood. Matt Coleman did things the right way, with honor and intention. It was one of the many reasons she'd fallen in love with him. The storm raged for hours more, but they stayed by the fire, talking in low voices about everything and nothing. About the ranch Matt wanted to build, the horses he planned to breed. About Margaret's dreams for Sullivan Ranch, not the empire Thomas envisioned, but a place where people were treated fairly and the land was respected. "I want to set up a school," she said, "for the ranch children and the Mexican families and anyone else who wants to learn. Papa always said education was the great equalizer. The townspeople might not like that. Then they'll have to get used to disappointment." Her voice was firm. "I've spent too many years caring what people think. Look where it got me." Dawn was breaking when they finally stirred, the storm having blown itself out. The world outside was washed clean, puddles reflecting the pink and gold sky. They went out together to survey the damaged fences down. Debris scattered, but nothing that couldn't be fixed with hard work. "We should start for Austin soon," Matt said, checking the horses. "This weather will have turned the roads to mud, but Thomas won't expect anyone to travel in these conditions." Margaret finished. "It might work in our favor. Tomorrow, then, give the roads a day to dry out some." They worked side by side through the day, repairing what the storm had broken. There was a new ease between them now, casual touches and shared smiles that made the hard labor feel lighter. When their hands brushed passing tools back and forth, neither pulled away. That evening, as Margaret prepared dinner, she found herself humming something she hadn't done in years. Matt came in from the barn and stopped in the doorway, watching her with such naked affection that she felt her cheeks warm. "What?" she asked, self-conscious. "Nothing, just, you look happy." Margaret considered this. Despite everything, despite being driven from her home, despite the danger still lurking, despite the uncertain future, she was happy. Here in this simple house with this good man, doing honest work under the vast Texas sky. She'd found something she hadn't even known she was looking for. "I am," she said simply, "happier than I've ever been." Matt crossed to her, pulling her into his arms. They stood there in the kitchen, holding each other while the stew bubbled on the stove and the sun set through the windows. No words were needed. The moment was complete in itself. Tomorrow would bring challenges. The journey to Austin, the legal battle ahead, the confrontation with Thomas that must surely come. But tonight, they had the warmth of the kitchen, the comfort of each other's arms, and the promise sealed with a kiss in the middle of a storm. "Forever," Matt murmured against her hair, and Margaret smiled. "Forever, darling," she whispered back. Outside, the first stars were appearing in the clear sky, bearing witness to a love that had weathered 8 years of separation and would weather whatever storms lay ahead. In the morning, they would ride for Austin and justice. But tonight, they were simply Matt and Margaret, two souls who had found their way home to each other at last. The town of Pecos seemed smaller than Margaret remembered. Dust-covered buildings huddled against the endless Texas prairie. She and Matt had come for supplies before their journey to Austin, and Margaret kept her hat pulled low, hoping to avoid recognition. They'd been living in their own small world at Matt's ranch for nearly a month now, and the return to civilization felt jarring. "I'll get the ammunition and provisions," Matt said, tying their horses outside Morrison's general store. "You stay close." But as Margaret waited by the horses, she heard a familiar voice that made her blood run cold. Through the window of the bank across the street, she could see Thomas Hartley holding court with several townsmen. His voice carried clearly in the still morning air. "And extending the railroad through Sullivan Ranch land will bring prosperity to the entire region," he was saying. "As the new owner, I'm committed to progress. My late father-in-law, God rest his soul, was too set in the old ways." Margaret's hands clenched into fists. How dare he invoke her father's memory while stealing his legacy? Mrs. Hartley. She spun to find Mrs. Chen, the wife of their former ranch cook, looking at her with wide eyes. "Mrs. Chen," Margaret said quietly, "please. We heard you were dead," the older woman whispered. "Mr. Hartley said you ran off in a storm, that they found your horse. As you can see, I'm very much alive." "Mrs. Chen glanced nervously toward the bank. "Sam never believed it. He said you were too smart to die in a storm. But Mr. Hartley has everyone afraid. He fired all the old hands, brought in his own men, hard men." "How is Sam and the others?" "Struggling, Mr. Hartley cut wages, increased hours. Some have left to find work elsewhere. Others—" She shrugged helplessly. "Where can they go?" Before Margaret could respond, the bank door opened. Thomas emerged, still talking, gesturing grandly. Then his eyes fell on her, and he stopped mid-sentence. For a moment, they stood frozen, staring at each other across the dusty street. Thomas's face went through several expressions: shock, anger, and finally, a cold satisfaction that chilled Margaret to her bone. "Gentlemen," he said smoothly, never taking his eyes off her, "if you'll excuse me, I've just spotted an old friend." He strode across the street, his expensive boots clicking on the wooden boardwalk. Margaret stood her ground, chin raised. As he approached, "Margaret," he said, loud enough for passers-by to hear, My dear wife, we've been so worried about you. I'm not your wife, she said clearly. Not anymore. His eyes narrowed, but his public smile never wavered. The law says otherwise. You took vows. Remember, in sickness and in health, till death do us part. You broke those vows long before I left. Did I? He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Prove it. Oh, wait, you can't, because according to everyone who matters, I'm a grieving husband searching for his troubled wife. Poor thing, never quite recovered from her father's death, makes up stories, sees conspiracies everywhere. You know what you did. I know I've built an empire from your father's outdated little ranch. I know I've brought progress and prosperity to this region, and I know you have nothing but wild accusations and a piece of paper that no one will believe is real. Margaret's heart sank. You know about the will. Of course I know. Did you really think you could hide at Coleman's ranch forever? I have eyes everywhere. My dear. His smile turned cruel. Though I must say, I'm disappointed. Running straight to another man's bed. What will people think? Nothing happened. No, a month living in sin with a man who's harbored feelings for you since he was a hired hand, who's going to believe that? He leaned closer still. Come home, Margaret. I'll forgive everything. We'll say you were overwrought with grief, not responsible for your actions. I'll even let Coleman keep his little ranch, as long as he stays away from you. And if I refuse, then I'll destroy him. I'll buy his loans, call in his debts. I'll make sure no one in Texas will do business with him. I'll see him ruined, and everyone will know it's because he couldn't keep his hands off another man's wife. Margaret felt rage rise in her throat. You're despicable. I'm practical, and I'm offering you a choice. Come home now. Play the dutiful wife, and Coleman survives. Refuse, and watch me destroy everything he's built. Margaret. She turned to see Matt emerging from the store, his expression darkening as he took in the scene. He moved to her side, solid and reassuring. Hardly, he said evenly. Coleman. Thomas's smile was all teeth. I was just explaining to my wife that it's time she came home. The lady made her choice clear when she left. The lady, Thomas said, emphasizing the word mockingly, is my legal property. Ask any judge in Texas. Matt stepped forward, but Margaret caught his arm. He's trying to provoke you, she said quietly. Don't give him the satisfaction. Thomas laughed. Listen to her. Coleman. She always was the smart one. Too smart for her own good, some might say. A crowd was beginning to gather, drawn by the confrontation. Margaret recognized several faces townspeople who'd known her father, who'd attended her wedding to Thomas. She saw judgment in some eyes, pity in others. I have a proposition, Thomas announced, raising his voice for the crowd. A public challenge. Let's settle this like civilized people. A vote, right here in Pecos. Let the good citizens decide should a wife return to her lawful husband, or should she be allowed to live in sin with another man. That's not, Matt began, but Thomas cut him off. Unless you'd prefer pistols at dawn, I'm amenable to that as well, though it would be a shame if Margaret became a widow before she's even properly divorced. Margaret felt the trap closing. Thomas had planned this, orchestrated it perfectly, in public, with witnesses, where any wrong move would destroy their credibility. Neither, she said, stepping forward. I propose something different. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Oh, a legal challenge in Austin. With Judge Morrison presiding, you remember Judge Morrison, don't you, Thomas? The one who witnessed Papa's real will. Thomas's smile faltered for just a moment. Morrison's an old fool. Morrison's the most respected judge in Texas, Margaret continued, addressing the crowd now. If Thomas is so certain of his position, he should have no fear of presenting his case before an honest court. Murmurs ran through the gathered townspeople. Margaret pressed on. I have evidence that my father's will was falsified. That Thomas Hartley and Eleanor Sullivan conspired to steal my inheritance. If I'm wrong, if I'm just a grieving daughter making up stories, then surely Thomas won't mind proving that before Judge Morrison. "You're upset," Thomas said, but his voice had lost some of its smooth confidence, not thinking clearly. "Then prove it," Margaret challenged. "Meet me in Austin, present your will, and I'll present mine. Let justice decide, not mob rule or violence." The crowd was definitely interested now. Margaret heard someone whisper about Judge Morrison's reputation for fairness. Another mentioned that old Sullivan had always spoken highly of the Austin judge. Thomas's face had gone cold. "You'll regret this." "I regret many things," Margaret replied, "but seeking justice for my father isn't one of them." She turned to Matt. "We should go." They walked to their horses together, the crowd parting to let them pass. Margaret could feel Thomas's stare boring into her back, but she didn't turn around. It was only when they were mounted and riding out of town that she allowed herself to shake. "That was dangerous," Matt said quietly. "Challenging him publicly like that. It was necessary. Now he has to come to Austin or look like he has something to hide." She managed a wan smile. "Besides, you were about to punch him. I could see it in your shoulders." "Was it that obvious?" "To me, yes." She reached over, briefly touching his hand where it rested on his saddle horn. "Thank you for not rising to his bait." "He threatened you? Called you property?" Matt's jaw was still tight with suppressed anger. "I wanted to—" "I know, but that's what he wanted. A fight, a scandal, something to use against us." Margaret straightened in her saddle. He showed his hand. "Though, he's worried about Judge Morrison. That means we have a chance. He also threatened to ruin me if you don't go back to him." "Are you worried?" Matt considered this. "I've built my ranch from nothing once. I can do it again if I have to. But I won't stand by and watch him force you back into that marriage." "He won't," Margaret said firmly. "I'll see Sullivan Ranch burned to the ground before I let Thomas Hartley own another day of my life." They rode in silence for a while, the town falling away behind them. Finally, Matt spoke again. "The way you handled that, turning his public challenge against him, your father would have been proud." Margaret smiled, a real smile this time. "Papa always said the best way to fight a bully was to make him play by the rules. Thomas thought he had me cornered, but now the whole town knows we're taking this to Austin. He'll have to follow through or lose face. And when we get to Austin, then we fight, with law instead of guns, with truth instead of threats." She looked at Matt, her partner in all things now. "Are you ready for that?" "I've been ready since the day you rode through my gate in that snowstorm," he said simply. "Whatever comes, we face it together." Margaret nodded, her heart full despite the challenges ahead. Thomas had shown his true nature today, not just to her, but to witnesses. The battle for Sullivan Ranch and her freedom was far from over. But for the first time since her father's death, she had hoped that justice might actually prevail. The road to Austin stretched out before them, long and uncertain, but with Matt beside her and the truth in her saddlebag, Margaret Sullivan was ready to reclaim not just her inheritance, but her life. The law office of Morrison and Associates occupied a limestone building on Congress Avenue in Austin. Margaret stood before its imposing entrance, her father's will secure in her leather satchel, Matt steady at her side. They'd ridden hard for 4 days to get here, and now the moment of truth had arrived. "Judge Morrison will see you now," the clerk announced, leading them down a hallway lined with law books. Judge Morrison looked exactly as Margaret remembered, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, with hands that bore the calluses of a man who'd worked his own land before taking up law. He rose as they entered, his weathered face breaking into a smile. "Margaret Sullivan," he said warmly. "You have your father's eyes. I was sorry to hear of his passing." "Thank you, Judge. And it's still Sullivan, despite what Thomas Hartley claims." Morrison's expression darkened. "Yes, I've heard some disturbing rumors." Please sit. Tell me everything. For the next hour, Margaret laid out the whole story. Her father's sudden death, Thomas's swift takeover, the convenient appearance of a will leaving everything to Eleanor. Morrison listened without interruption, occasionally making notes. Finally, Margaret produced the hidden will. This is what I found in Papa's secret drawer. You witnessed it, didn't you? Morrison examined the document carefully, running his fingers over the seal. I did indeed. 2 weeks before his death, your father was very specific about his wishes. He looked up sharply. He was also very concerned about Thomas Hartley's influence over Eleanor. Said he wanted to ensure you were protected. Then you'll help us. My dear, nothing would give me greater pleasure than to see justice done for Jim Sullivan. But we'll need more than just this will. Thomas has had months to establish his claim, to grease the right palms. We need witnesses, evidence of wrongdoing, something that proves deliberate fraud. Matt spoke for the first time. What kind of evidence? Morrison leaned back in his chair. Ideally, someone who saw the false will being created, or proof that Thomas was planning this before your father's death. Financial records showing suspicious transactions. Anything that demonstrates premeditation. Margaret's heart sank. I don't have access to any of that. Thomas controls everything now. Not everything, Morrison said thoughtfully. There are people in this town who remember your father fondly. People who might be willing to help, if approached correctly. He wrote several names on a piece of paper. Start with these folks. Father Miguel at the San Antonio mission, he kept copies of all legal documents he witnessed. Mrs. Adelaide Worthington, she and your father did business together for years, and she has no love for Thomas Hartley. And Samuel Bergman at the First Bank of Austin. Your father's accounts might tell an interesting story. Margaret took the list gratefully. Thank you, but will this be enough? We'll make it enough, Morrison said firmly. I've scheduled a preliminary hearing for next week. That'll force Thomas to present his will publicly and give us the right to challenge it. In the meantime, gather what evidence you can. They left the office with renewed purpose. Austin was larger than Margaret remembered, bustling with politicians and businessmen. But she navigated to the San Antonio mission without hesitation. Father Miguel, ancient but alert, greeted them warmly. Señorita Sullivan, he said in accented English, I have been expecting you. You have... Your father. He was a careful man. He left instructions, in case something happened. The priest produced a sealed envelope. He said if you came asking questions, I should give you this. With trembling hands, Margaret opened the envelope. Inside was a letter in her father's handwriting. My dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, then my fears have come to pass. I've discovered Thomas has been slowly poisoning Eleanor's mind against you, turning her greedy and grasping. I suspect he plans to use her to steal what is rightfully yours. I've taken precautions. The will Morrison witnessed is my true testament. But if Thomas acts as I fear he might, you'll need allies. Trust Morrison. Trust Father Miguel. And there's a man named Matthew Coleman who left my employ some years ago. Find him if you can. He's the kind of man I'd have been proud to call son. Your loving father, James Sullivan. Margaret had to sit down, tears streaming down her face. Matt knelt beside her, one hand on her shoulder. He knew, she whispered. Papa knew what Thomas was planning? This letter is evidence, Father Miguel said gently. It shows your father's state of mind, his concerns about Senor Hartley. It will help your case. Their next stop was the bank. Samuel Bergman, a thin man with careful eyes, reviewed their request skeptically until Morrison's name was mentioned. Morrison sent you, well then. He disappeared into the back, returning with a ledger. I shouldn't show you this, but there were irregularities in the months before your father's death. Large withdrawals, transfers to accounts in Thomas Hartley's name, all authorized with your father's signature. But, Matt prompted. The signatures looked wrong to me. I knew Jim Sullivan for 15 years. watched him sign hundreds of documents. These were different, shakier, as if signed under duress or by someone trying to copy his hand. "Would you testify to that?" Margaret asked. Bergman hesitated, then nodded. "Jim Sullivan helped me establish this bank when no one else would trust a German immigrant. I owe him that much." The final visit was to Adelaide Worthington, the wealthiest woman in Austin and Margaret's godmother. She received them in her elegant parlor, her sharp blue eyes missing nothing. "Margaret, darling," she said, embracing her goddaughter. "I've been wondering when you'd come to see me. You know why I'm here." "Of course. Thomas Hartley's been spreading his version of events to anyone who'll listen. Says you've gone mad with grief, run off with a farmhand." She glanced at Matt with amusement. "Though I must say, if this is the farmhand in question, I understand the temptation." Matt colored, but Margaret kept her focus. "Aunt Adelaide, I need your help." "You have it. Your father was one of the few men in Texas who treated me as an equal in business. I'll not see his daughter cheated by that snake Hartley." She rang for her secretary. "Charles, bring me the Sullivan correspondence file." The file was thick with years of business letters. Adelaide pulled out several from the past year. "Look at these. Your father was growing increasingly concerned about Thomas's influence. He mentions discovering discrepancies in the ranch accounts, finding Thomas in his study at odd hours. And here, she produced a letter dated a week before his death. He says he's changing his will to protect you." "This is exactly what we need." Margaret breathed. "There's more," Adelaide said. "I have connections throughout Texas society. By the time I'm done, everyone who matters will know the truth about Thomas Hartley. He thinks he can use public opinion against you. Let's see how he likes it when the tide turns." They spent the next week gathering evidence and allies. Father Miguel provided copies of every document he'd witnessed. Bergman prepared a detailed analysis of the suspicious financial transactions. Adelaide held tea parties where she carefully planted seeds of doubt about Thomas's story. Matt was Margaret's constant support, helping her organize documents, accompanying her to meetings, simply being there when the weight of it all threatened to overwhelm her. "We're building a strong case," he said one evening as they reviewed their evidence in their hotel. "Morrison thinks we have a real chance." "It's not just about the ranch anymore," Margaret said. "It's about justice for Papa. He tried so hard to protect me, even from beyond the grave." Matt took her hand. "He'd be proud of you, the way you fought, the way you've refused to give up. I couldn't have done it without you." "You could have," Matt said firmly. "You're the strongest woman I know, but I'm glad you didn't have to." A knock at the door interrupted them. A messenger handed Margaret an envelope. Thomas had arrived in Austin and was demanding an immediate meeting. "He's trying to negotiate," Margaret said after reading the note, "offering me a settlement to drop the challenge." "Will you meet him?" Margaret stood, squaring her shoulders. "Yes, but not to negotiate, to let him know that Margaret Sullivan doesn't run anymore. Tomorrow, we face him in court with the truth, and the truth will set me free." She looked out the window at the Austin skyline, thinking of her father, of the ranch that bore their name, of all the people who'd stepped forward to help when she needed them most. Thomas had wealth and influence, but she had something more powerful: righteousness and the support of good people. The battle for Sullivan Ranch would be decided in a courtroom, with words instead of guns. But Margaret was ready. She'd found her voice, her strength, and her allies. Now it was time to reclaim her birthright and expose Thomas Hartley for the fraud he was. The Travis County Courthouse stood imposing in the morning sun, its limestone walls a testament to Texas justice. Margaret climbed the steps with Matt beside her, Judge Morrison and their witnesses following behind. The courtroom was already packed. Adelaide's social campaign had ensured that all of Austin society would witness this confrontation. Thomas Hartley sat at the plaintiff's table, impeccably dressed and supremely confident. Beside him, Eleanor clutched a handkerchief, playing the role of grieving widow to perfection. Thomas's lawyer, Marcus Blackwood, was known as the most ruthless attorney in Texas. All rise for the Honorable Judge William Thornton. The bailiff announced. Judge Thornton, a stern man with piercing eyes, took his seat. This hearing concerns the contested last will and testament of James Sullivan. Mr. Blackwood, you may present your client's position. Blackwood stood smoothly. Your Honor, this is a simple matter. We have a legal will, properly witnessed and filed, leaving the Sullivan estate to his beloved wife, Eleanor. We also have a grieving daughter, unfortunately overcome by the loss of her father, who has manufactured a false document in her desperation. Objection, Morrison said calmly. Counsel is presenting opinion as fact. Sustained. Stick to the evidence. Mr. Blackwood. Blackwood produced the will favoring Eleanor. This document was witnessed by two respected citizens and filed immediately after Mr. Sullivan's death. Mrs. Eleanor Sullivan has been managing the estate responsibly for months. Now, Mr. Morrison, Judge Thornton said, what evidence do you have to challenge this will? Morrison stood. Your Honor, we have substantial evidence that the will Mr. Blackwood presents is fraudulent, and that the true will is the one in Miss Sullivan's possession. He presented Margaret's will. This document, dated 2 weeks before James Sullivan's death, was witnessed by myself and Father Miguel of the San Antonio Mission. I remember the day clearly, Mr. Sullivan was very specific about his wishes to leave the ranch to his daughter. Anyone can claim to remember something, Blackwood interrupted. Memory is fallible, which is why we have supporting evidence. Morrison continued smoothly. He introduced Father Miguel's testimony, the copies from the mission archives, and then Adelaide's correspondence. These letters show that James Sullivan intended to change his will specifically to prevent Mr. Hartley from gaining control of the estate. Morrison explained. In this letter dated 1 week before his death, he explicitly states his concerns. Thomas's confident expression wavered slightly. Blackwood objected, but Judge Thornton allowed the letters into evidence. Then came Samuel Bergman's testimony about the suspicious signatures and financial transfers. These transactions transferred significant assets to Mr. Hartley's control in the months before Mr. Sullivan's death, the banker stated. The signatures authorizing them are, in my professional opinion, forgeries. This is circumstantial, Blackwood protested. Where is the proof of deliberate fraud? Judge Thornton looked thoughtful. Mr. Morrison, while your evidence is compelling, I need something more concrete to overturn an existing probated will. Margaret felt her heart sink. They'd come so far, but it might not be enough. Then Eleanor suddenly stood. I can't do this anymore. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Thomas grabbed her arm. Eleanor, sit down. No. She pulled free, her voice growing stronger. I won't be party to this anymore. She turned to the judge. Your Honor, I have something to say. Eleanor, don't, Thomas started. Silence. Mr. Hartley. Judge Thornton commanded. Continue. Mrs. Sullivan. Eleanor took a shaky breath. The will Thomas presented is false. He had it created after Jim died. Made me sign papers saying I'd witnessed it earlier. He said it was just a formality, that Jim would have wanted me provided for. The courtroom exploded. Judge Thornton banged his gavel repeatedly. Order, Mrs. Sullivan. Are you saying you knowingly participated in fraud? I didn't know at first, Eleanor said, tears streaming down her face. Thomas told me Jim had forgotten to file the new will, that we were just making official what Jim intended. But then I found out. She looked directly at Margaret. I found out what really happened to your father. Margaret's blood ran cold. What do you mean? The night Jim died, he didn't fall from his horse. Thomas was there. They argued about the will Jim had just signed the real one, leaving everything to you. Thomas was furious. They struggled. And Jim Jim fell down the stairs. Thomas said it was an accident, that no one would believe us, that we had to say Jim was thrown from his horse. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Thomas had gone pale, his hands clenched on the table. "You're saying Thomas Hartley killed James Sullivan?" Judge Thornton asked carefully. "I'm saying Jim Sullivan died after a struggle with Thomas Hartley, and we lied about how it happened." Eleanor said, "I've been living with this guilt, watching Thomas take over everything, watching him search for Margaret to silence her too. I can't do it anymore." "She's lying," Thomas erupted, jumping to his feet. "She's obviously been coerced." "Mr. Hartley, you will be silent," Judge Thornton ordered. He turned to the bailiff. "I think we need the sheriff here, immediately." What followed was chaos. Thomas tried to flee but was restrained. Eleanor collapsed, sobbing. Margaret sat frozen, trying to process that her father had been murdered. Matt's hand found hers under the table, warm and steady. "Breathe," he whispered. "Just breathe." Judge Thornton restored order eventually. "Based on this testimony and the evidence presented, I am ruling that the will presented by Mr. Hartley is fraudulent. The legitimate will is the one held by Miss Sullivan, leaving the Sullivan Ranch to her. Furthermore, I'm ordering an immediate investigation into the death of James Sullivan." Sheriff Coleman, no relation to Matt, arrived to arrest Thomas on charges of fraud and suspicion of murder. As they led him away, he turned to Margaret with naked hatred. "This isn't over," he snarled. "You think you've won, You'll what?" Margaret stood, finding her voice at last. "You've already taken my father from me. You've stolen months of my life. You have nothing left to threaten me with." Thomas was dragged away, still cursing. Eleanor approached Margaret hesitantly. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I was weak and greedy, and I let him convince me. Can you ever forgive me?" Margaret studied her stepmother, really looked at her for the first time in months. Eleanor seemed smaller, older, diminished by the weight of her guilt. "You told the truth when it mattered," Margaret said finally. "That took courage. As for forgiveness, ask me again in time. For now, I'm grateful you finally chose justice over comfort." Judge Morrison approached as the courtroom emptied. "Your father would be proud. Margaret, you fought with honor and prevailed." "We prevailed," Margaret corrected, looking at Matt and all their supporters. "I couldn't have done this alone." Outside the courthouse, Adelaide Worthington held court with the society ladies, ensuring everyone knew the full story. The Sullivan name would be cleared. Thomas Hartley's reputation destroyed. "It's over," Matt said as they stood on the courthouse steps. "You've got your ranch back." Margaret took a deep breath of free air. "Part of it's over. There's still a trial to come for Thomas, and the ranch to rebuild. But yes, the worst is behind us." "What about Eleanor?" "The will Papa left provides for her. She'll have a comfortable income and can stay in the guest house if she chooses. Despite everything, I don't think she's evil, just weak and led astray." They walked toward their horses, and Margaret felt the weight of the past months lifting from her shoulders. She had questions still about her father's final moments, about how she'd move forward. But for now, she had reclaimed her name, her land, and her life. "There's something else," Matt said as they reached the horses. "Now that you're a woman of property again, independent and free, there's a question I've been waiting to ask properly." Margaret's heart skipped, but she kept her voice light. "Just one question." "Well, several, actually, starting with whether you'd like company on the ride back to Sullivan Ranch, and ending with—" He paused, his gray eyes serious. "Ending with whether you might consider making that we've been using permanent?" Margaret smiled, feeling truly free for the first time in years. "Ask me properly when we get home. Matthew Coleman. For now, yes, I'd very much like company on the ride." They mounted up and turned their horses toward home, behind them. Austin buzzed with gossip about the dramatic trial. Ahead lay Sullivan Ranch, waiting for its rightful owner to return. Margaret Sullivan rode tall in her saddle, no longer running from her past but riding toward her future. Justice had prevailed, truth had conquered lies, and love had outlasted separation. The road home stretched before them, golden in the afternoon sun, and Margaret knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would never face them alone again. The sun was setting over Sullivan Ranch when Margaret and Matt rode through the gates. The old hands had already heard the news. Sam Chen stood on the porch with several others, their face bright with hope. As Margaret dismounted, they surrounded her with warm greetings and careful embraces. "Miss Margaret," Sam said, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "Welcome home." "It's good to be back, Sam, though I suspect Thomas left quite a mess for us to sort through." "Nothing we can't fix together," Jake Morrison, the old foreman, assured her. "Most of Hartley's men lit out soon as they heard he'd been arrested. The rest, well, they're packing now." Margaret spent the next days assessing the damage. Thomas had indeed left chaos debts to suppliers, alienated neighbors, demoralized workers. But as word spread of her return, people began arriving to help. Ranchers who'd respected her father offered credit. Former hands returned seeking work. Even Eleanor, residing quietly in the guest house, provided detailed accounts of Thomas's dealings. It was a week later, as Margaret stood surveying the sunset from her father's study, her study now that Matt found her. He'd been invaluable during the transition, his quiet strength and practical knowledge helping restore order. "The last of Hartley's men left this afternoon," he reported. "Jake's got the regular hands back on schedule. The ranch is yours again. Truly." "Ours," Margaret corrected softly, then caught herself. I know what you mean." Matt moved to stand beside her at the window. "But that's actually what I wanted to talk to you about." He reached into his vest pocket, producing something that caught the dying light. Margaret's breath caught as she recognized it, a simple silver ring, handmade, with delicate engraving around the band. "You said to ask properly when we got home," Matt said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "Well, we're home now." He dropped to one knee, and Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. "Margaret Sullivan," he began, "I've loved you for 8 years. I've loved you when you belonged to another, when you were lost and broken, when you were fighting to reclaim your life. I've seen you at your strongest and your weakest, and every moment has only made me more certain." He held up the ring. "I made this from the first silver dollar I earned from my own land. It's not much, no fancy jewels or city polish, but it's honest work, made with my own hands, and it's yours if you'll have it, if you'll have me." Margaret sank to her knees in front of him, cupping his face in her hands. "Matthew Coleman, you impossible, wonderful man, don't you know by now that all I've ever wanted was something real, something true?" "Is that a yes?" "That's a forever yes," she whispered. "Forever, darling." His hands shook slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, the silver warm against her skin. Then he was kissing her, and she was crying and laughing at the same time, and the whole world narrowed down to this moment, this man, this promise. When they finally drew apart, Matt helped her to her feet. "There's no preacher in town right now. Father Miguel's traveling, won't be back for 2 weeks." "Then we wait," Margaret said simply. "I want to do this right. A proper wedding, with our friends there to witness. Besides," she smiled, "I need time to have a dress made. I won't marry you in trail clothes. Matt Coleman." He laughed, the sound rich and warm. "Anything you want. I've waited 8 years. I can wait 2 more weeks." Word of the engagement spread quickly. Adelaide arrived from Austin with a seamstress in tow, declaring that her goddaughter would have a wedding dress worthy of the Sullivan name. The ranch women gathered to plan the feast. Even Eleanor, tentative but sincere, offered to help with preparations. "I know I have no right to act as family, she said carefully. "But if you need anything." Margaret studied her stepmother. The trial had aged Eleanor, but it had also seemed to free her from Thomas's influence. She was quieter now, humbler, but also more genuine. "The flowers," Margaret said finally. "You always had a gift with arrangements. Would you handle the church flowers?" Eleanor's face lit up with grateful surprise. "I'd be honored." The 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparations. Matt divided his time between his ranch and Sullivan Ranch, slowly moving his small herd to merge with Margaret's larger operation. They would live at Sullivan Ranch. It made practical sense, but Margaret insisted on keeping his cabin maintained. "It's where you saved me," she said simply. "Where I learned to be myself again. We can't let it fall to ruin." The wedding day dawned clear and bright, one of those perfect Texas mornings where the sky seemed to stretch forever. Margaret stood before the mirror in her childhood room, wearing the cream silk dress Adelaide had commissioned. It was elegant but practical. She'd insisted on being able to ride in it if necessary, which had made the seamstress laugh. Sam Chen's wife helped her with the final touches, pinning orange blossoms in her hair. "Your father would be so proud," she said softly, "seeing you like this, marrying a good man who loves you true." "I wish he could be here," Margaret admitted. "He is, Miss Margaret, in the land, in the people who loved him, in you. He is here." The small church was packed. It seemed all of Pecos and the surrounding ranches had come to witness Margaret Sullivan marry Matthew Coleman. Jake Morrison walked her down the aisle, having volunteered for the honor with gruff emotion. Matt waited at the altar, dressed in his best suit but still radiating that quiet strength that had drawn her from the beginning. His eyes never left hers as she approached, and the love she saw there made her steps sure and steady. Father Miguel returned just in time, performed the ceremony with warmth and dignity. When he asked if anyone objected to the union, there was a moment of tense silence, everyone remembering the last wedding. The wrong wedding, but it passed peacefully. "Margaret," Matt said when it came time for vows, "I promise to love you, protect you, and stand beside you in all things. I promise to respect your strength, support your dreams, and build a life with you based on trust and truth. I promise to be your partner in work and rest, in plenty and in want, in joy and sorrow. Forever. Darling." Margaret had to blink back tears before she could respond. "Matthew, you gave me shelter when I had none, believed in me when I barely believed in myself, and showed me that love doesn't have to be a cage. I promise to love you, stand with you, and build a life of honesty and purpose together. I promise to be your partner in all things, to trust you with my whole heart, and to make our home a place of peace and joy. Forever, darling." When Father Miguel pronounced them husband and wife, when Matt kissed her with tender reverence while the church erupted in cheers, Margaret felt the last chains of her past fall away. The celebration that followed was unlike anything Sullivan Ranch had seen, not the stilted formal reception of her first wedding, but a real feast. Mexican vaqueros played guitars, couples danced on the lawn, children ran between tables laden with food. Margaret danced with Matt, with Jake, with every old hand who'd stayed loyal through the dark months. "No fancy honeymoon trip?" Adelaide asked, finding them taking a breath between dances. "We'll go to San Antonio for a few days," Margaret said, leaning into Matt's solid warmth. "But honestly, Aunt Adelaide, we've both been away from home too long. What we want most is just to be here, together, building something real." As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Margaret stood with her husband looking out over Sullivan Ranch. Tomorrow would bring work and challenges. There were still debts to pay, relationships to rebuild, Thomas's trial to face. But tonight, surrounded by friends and family, with Matt's ring on her finger and his arm around her waist, Margaret Sullivan Coleman was exactly where she belonged. "Any regrets?" Matt asked softly. "Only one," she said, turning in his arms. "That it took us so long to get here." Maybe we needed that time, he suggested, to become who we are now, strong enough to build something lasting. Margaret rose on her toes to kiss him, not caring who saw. Then it was worth it. Every moment of pain, every mile of running, every fight for justice, it was all worth it to be standing here with you. The stars were coming out, one by one, over the vast Texas sky. The party continued around them, full of music and laughter and hope, and Margaret knew, with bone-deep certainty, that her father was watching, and he was pleased. She was home, she was free, and she was loved by a good man who saw her true worth. Forever, darling, she thought, and stepped into her future with joy. The small library began in what used to be Margaret's mother's sewing room, just 3 shelves at first, filled with books donated by Adelaide and ordered from San Antonio. But word spread quickly through the valley the Sullivan Ranch was opening its doors to anyone who wanted to learn. 20 children came today. Margaret told Matt one evening 6 months after their wedding. She was covered in chalk dust and glowing with satisfaction. 20, and not just ranch children. The Martinez family brought their daughters all the way from Willow Creek. Matt smiled, pulling her into his lap as they sat on the porch. That's because word's gotten out that Mrs. Coleman doesn't turn anyone away. Mexican, Anglo, Freeman doesn't matter to you. Knowledge shouldn't have a color or a language, Margaret said firmly. Papa believed that. He taught Sam Chen to read contracts so no one could cheat him. It's right that we continue that work. The library grew. What started as a few shelves became a proper addition to the house. Margaret hired Miss Catherine Wells, a young teacher from back east who'd come to Texas for her health and stayed for the purpose Margaret offered. Together, they taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and anything else the eager students wanted to learn. Not everyone approved. Some of the neighboring ranchers grumbled about uppity workers who could read their own contracts. A few even tried to forbid their hands from attending. Let them complain, Matt said when Margaret worried. We're building something bigger than they understand. Educated workers are better workers. They can keep proper tallies, read breeding records, understand market reports. It benefits everyone. He was right. The Sullivan Ranch began to prosper in ways that had nothing to do with cattle prices. Their hands stayed longer, worked harder, took pride in being part of something meaningful. Other ranchers began quietly sending their own children to the library school. It was a year after the wedding when Margaret realized she was with child. She discovered it one morning while teaching, suddenly dizzy and nauseated at the smell of chalk. Catherine took over the class while Margaret stumbled outside and found Matt in the barn. I need to tell you something, she said, and watched his face transform from concern to wonder to pure joy. He lifted her off her feet, spinning her around before remembering her condition and setting her down gently. A baby, our baby. Our baby, she confirmed, laughing at his expression. Due in the spring, I think. The months that followed were a blur of preparation and growth, both of the child within her and the community they were building. Matt wouldn't let her lift anything heavier than a book, which drove Margaret to distraction until Catherine suggested she focus on creating a curriculum for the older students. Eleanor, who had become a quiet but constant presence, threw herself into preparing the nursery. Let me do this, she said when Margaret protested it was too much. Let me help welcome your child properly. It's what Jim would have wanted. Thomas's trial had concluded with a life sentence for murder and fraud. He would never trouble them again. Eleanor had testified with dignity, accepting her own culpability while ensuring justice was done. The experience had humbled her but also freed her. She found purpose in helping with the school, teaching needlework and basic medicine to the older girls. The Sullivan Ranch became a haven. Families fleeing trouble in Mexico found work and shelter. Young women escaping bad situations discovered they could earn their keep teaching or helping with the books while they figured out their next steps. Matt built additional housing, simple but sturdy homes for families who wanted to put down roots. We're becoming a town, he observed one day, watching children play between the houses while their parents worked. Sullivan Township has a nice ring to it. Coleman Township, Margaret corrected, then reconsidered. Or maybe Hope Township. That's what we're really building here. Isn't it Hope? Their daughter arrived on a perfect April morning. After a long but uncomplicated labor, Margaret had insisted on Catherine being present along with the midwife. "I want my daughter born into a world where women support each other," she said. The baby had Matt's gray eyes and Margaret's determined chin. They named her Faith Hope Coleman, for the future they were building and the trust that had brought them together. "She's perfect," Matt whispered, cradling his daughter with infinite tenderness. "Look what we made, Margaret. Look what love built." The library school's first graduation was held when Faith was 6 months old. 5 young adults had completed the full course of study Margaret and Catherine had developed. 2 were heading to college in Austin. Adelaide had quietly established a scholarship fund. The others had positions waiting at banks and businesses throughout Texas, places that needed educated workers who understood both Anglo and Mexican communities. "My father would be so proud," Margaret said, watching the graduates receive their certificates. She stood with Faith in her arms, Matt solid beside her. "We've built something that matters. We've built a family," Matt corrected gently. "Not just our little family, but this whole community. People who believe in fairness and learning and second chances." As if to underscore his point, Sam Chen's grandson toddled over, offering baby Faith a wooden toy his grandfather had carved. The children played together on a blanket while their parents planned the next year's curriculum, discussing dreams that would have seemed impossible just a few years before. That evening, Margaret and Matt walked out to the hill where her parents were buried. They brought Faith, who gurgled happily in her father's arms, fascinated by the sunset painting the sky in brilliant colors. "We did it, Papa," Margaret said softly to the headstone. "We saved your legacy. But more than that, we transformed it into something greater. The Sullivan Ranch isn't just about cattle and land anymore. It's about people. It's about hope." Matt wrapped his free arm around her as Faith began to fuss. "Time to head home," he said. "Catherine's staying for supper, and I think Jake's sweet on her. Could be another wedding soon?" Margaret laughed, leaning into his warmth. "From tragedy to joy. That seems to be our way, doesn't it?" "Our way," Matt agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I like the sound of that." They walked back down the hill together, toward the warm lights of home. Behind them, the vast Texas sky stretched endless and full of stars. Ahead, the Sullivan Ranch buzzed with life children finishing lessons, families gathering for evening meals, young couples courting by the corral. On the porch, Eleanor was teaching a group of girls to knit. Catherine and Jake were indeed deep in conversation by the garden. The vaqueros were tuning their guitars for the weekly evening of music that had become tradition. "Stop," Margaret said suddenly, causing Matt to pause. "Just stop for a moment and look at this. Look what we've built from ashes and determination." Matt shifted Faith to one arm and pulled Margaret close with the other. "We've built a life," he said simply. "A good life. A life that matters." "Forever?" she asked, echoing their old promise. "Forever, darling," he confirmed, and kissed her there in the doorway of their home, while their daughter laughed and reached for the stars just beginning to appear in the Texas sky. Inside, warmth and laughter waited. Outside, the land rolled on eternal and patient, holding their dreams and protecting their future. And Margaret Sullivan Coleman knew, with every fiber of her being, that she was exactly where she belonged. The girl who had fled in a snowstorm with nothing but heartbreak and a hidden will had become a woman of substance and purpose. She had fought for justice, found true love, and built a legacy that would outlast any fortune in gold or cattle. This was her happy ending. But more than that, it was her beginning. Asterisk. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I'd love to know where in the world you're enjoying this tale. Please share in the comments below so we can connect and discuss your thoughts on Margaret and Matt's journey. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 like this video, and hit the hype button to help more listeners discover our romantic tales from the American frontier. Your support means the world and helps keep these stories alive. Until next time, Partners Asterisk.